This is rather long but a good reference on what is happening in Sweden and I imagine many European countries as well as Canada and coming now to the good OLEUS of A. Subject, long but good summary of the situation in Sweden. The war of attrition. About 10 years ago I had a few beers at the Sturhof outdoor restaurant in Stockholm in the company of an internationally renowned professor, a Swedish diplomat, a former CIA employee and a friend with international business connections. The CIA man asked us how we thought Swedish society was developing and what issues we thought would shape Swedish political life in the coming decade. I answered frankly, and as the only one present, migration and crime development. I had no difficulty seeing it coming. The following text is based on reports in the Swedish news media, as well as on conversations with concerned citizens whose lived experience stretches back in time to the record years and the establishment of the Swedish welfare utopia. The experience provides perspective and relief to the present we are living through. Conversations have also been held over time with police officers, social service workers, home care workers, the legal profession and the school world, as well as with immigrants who feel a sense of responsibility for their new homeland. The picture that emerges is of a social and moral dynamic that is as extensive as it is disruptive, and of a public sphere that could bring to mind Kafka or Orwell, or the breakneck logic of Alice in Wonderland. There is a war of attrition going on in Sweden, an erosion of resources, material, spiritual and moral reserves, a withering away of trust, cohesion and self-confidence, and of Sweden's national identity and self-image. The ethnically and culturally homogeneous, safe, efficient and internationally admired idol of peace has locally turned into a dysfunctional, multicultural dystopia, with clan criminality and Islamist enclaves beyond Swedish laws and social control. The relaxed security that I associate with the country of my youth has turned into denial, repression, resignation and despondency, or anxiety, anger and despair over a Sweden that has gradually ceased to be Sweden. Lately, the genie has been let out of the bottle. The corridor guards are crowded if not defeated. The Sweden Democrats' description of the problem is gaining new ground and new followers at an accelerating pace. The latest to emerge is moderate leader Ulf Kristersson. There is hope, after all. Mass immigration. Stefan Löfven's time in office has been marked to a significant degree by mass immigration, honor killings, gang rapes, humiliation robberies, violence against and robbery of Swedish elderly people, knife murders, shootings, highway pirates, balcony girls, car fires, school fires, church fires, vandalization of Christian gravesites, bomb attacks, kidnappings, antisocial domination behavior by young men from the Middle East and North Africa, stone throwing against blue light personnel and minorities wallowing in victim myths. We have had terrorist attacks and we have read about bombings, IS murderers, polygamy, genital mutilation, roadblocks, violent riots, violence in hospital emergency rooms, family feuds, child marriages, organized begging, Roma shanty towns, international theft gangs ravaging the countryside, deteriorating school results, class divisions on ethnic and cultural grounds, insecurity in the streets and squares, on buses, on trams and trains. Social unrest has translated into political instability. It is the consequences of migration that have underpinned the growth of SD and are the cause of recurrent government crises. Is it perhaps only a matter of time before foreign investors start to turn a deaf ear and look for more stable countries to invest in? I have long wondered where this tipping point goes. At this point, a Swedish policeman is murdered in the street by a 17-year-old hooligan who has committed a long list of serious crimes in the past, but who, because of perverse legislation, can move freely and pose a deadly danger to the city's inhabitants. No one can ignore the link between crime and migration any longer. 58% of all persons reasonably suspected of crimes in Sweden in 2017 were migrants. For murder, the figure was 73%. And it continues. During the second weekend in July, 8 shootings were reported around the country. In Umeå, a police officer was hit in the head with a pipe during an intervention in the botanical gardens in Lund, a man was subjected to attempted murder and taken to hospital with stab wounds, and a woman was stabbed in Djurgården. Previously, over a 2-week period, there had been shootings at Sahlgrenska Hospital in Gothenburg and from a motorcycle in Backa, gun threats against a nurse at Sahlgrenska, shootings at Varvatorgstorget in Biskopsgarden and on Vekagatan in Kortedala, and a fatal shooting of a 22-year-old in Biskopsgarden and one on Marklandsgatan in Högsbo. At the same time, serious incidents were reported in Huddinge, Holmstad, Borås, Trollhättan, Karlstad, Östersund, Pajala, Söderhamn, Västerås, Upplands Väsby, several places in Blekinge and Hammarkullen in Gothenburg. Destabilizing colonization. The integration of non-European immigrants has generally failed. Culturally determined differences are a reality, not a racist invention. This text does not seek to stigmatize immigrants, but bears witness to the fact that migration has turned into destabilizing colonization. The root cause is a conflict-generating migration of historic proportions, which has fundamentally altered Sweden's demographic structure, social life, political stability and cultural identity. In the first 6 months of the year, 37,934 people have been granted Swedish citizenship. At the same time, 45,340 people have been granted residence permits. This is according to the Swedish Migration Agency. On an annual basis, that's more than 2 Borås, Gavel or Södertälje. That's how it looks, year after year after year. Sweden is gradually becoming less and less Sweden. Why is that a good thing? The pressure is constantly increasing and gradually shaping itself into a systemic crisis, as Swedish companies cry out to the government about the debilitating effects of cross-border crime on their business, and a police chief talks about a deteriorating security situation, a term traditionally reserved for judgments about third world countries. In the context of the 2015 migration flows, the then Dutch Prime Minister warned that they must be halted if Europe was not to meet the same fate as the Roman Empire at the Gothic invasion in 410. It is in these larger terms of civilization that developments must now be seen, even if the Swedish leadership may seem unfamiliar with concepts of this type. Not Swedish cities. The second and third cities of the empire are no longer Swedish cities. In the peripheral areas of Stockholm, demographic and cultural developments look the same, and the change is also affecting smaller towns and cities. In recent years, many smaller Swedish municipalities have gained new residents who are unable to support themselves. They have arrived from metropolitan municipalities with housing shortages. An ethnic and cultural underclass is inevitably emerging in these municipalities, around 100 out of 290, with the economic and social consequences that this entails both in the short and long term. In the country as a whole, there are around 180 to 190 so-called exclusion areas, of which the police assessed 60 as vulnerable and 22 as particularly vulnerable in 2019. We can no longer move freely in all parts of our country and cities without the risk of being robbed, beaten or perhaps murdered. These events are not anecdotes. They are part of a pattern that is confirmed daily. We are living in the midst of a systemic crisis, brought on by a political class that has abandoned those it was supposed to protect. The incompetence of those in the leadership of the country entrusted with the task of administering our state and our society is striking and undermines confidence in the democratic system, and the state, as conflict-resolving stabilizers. Tendencies towards vigilantism have been noted, even in a small town like Bengtsfors, since crime there has got out of hand. The other day I received a message from a friend who was afraid of the SD and what would happen if this party came to power. DN's culture editor has warned that it will be cold in such a country. Such is the worldview and cognitive level of a significant proportion of Swedes, marinated in decades of social democratic indoctrination. The perception of reality is negligible and the ability to identify threats and risks non-existent. Emotions rule and have sometimes assumed almost quasi-religious dimensions. According to some kind of deformed logic, the Swedish murder wave and insecurity are the fault of the Sweden Democrats. Relativization. For most disconnected Swedes, most things in everyday life still seem to go on as usual. The upper middle class still lives mostly safely in their protected reserves, and the Swedish foot soldiers can still have a well-deserved Friday grog in their homes without being shot at. Most people still trust the established political class. They cling to the ideological or political blanket even if it is becoming sunburnt and worn. Many can continue to snigger self-righteously for a while longer and frown at those they claim to denigrate the development of Swedish society, all the while the mafia and the clans move up their positions. Denial is a well-known reaction, the arrogant dismissal and infamous suspicion of those who bring knowledge of system-threatening contexts has been widespread, accusations of phobias and extremism have been common, people don't want to upset their worldview and don't dare risk being pushed out of the social community, or losing their jobs. Those who have dared to take the plunge have been labeled by the corridor guards and their aides, as when a teacher in Luleå sought to draw attention to honor violence and was outcast by his colleagues as an Islamophobe. It was not the truth that interested these colleagues, but compliance with the imposed left liberal ideology, or set of values, as it is now called. It is estimated that 100,000 people in Sweden live under the oppression of honor as a result of migration from Muslim countries, quite independently of the Swedish public's helpless references to the values launched as a replacement for a historically inherited but now misappropriated community of values. 1,400 reports of violence and abuse that can be linked to the honor problem were on the police desk last winter, waiting to be investigated. In any case, those outside their comfort zones are increasingly exposed to the threatening social changes reported daily in the news media. Parents have growing reasons to be concerned about the safety of their children and young people. A quiet walk home in the balmy summer night can end in rape and aggravated assault at Solna Cemetery, resulting in serious physical injuries and perhaps lifelong trauma. And at some point, events occur both in Hovas, Örgryte and Östermalm, which suggests something of the change referred to here. On Christmas Eve, a man was stabbed on Länegatan in the middle of Östermalm and had to be taken to hospital. These days, there are reports of young men from the Middle East and North Africa manifesting their power and presence on Strandvägen in Stockholm and Vasagatan in Gothenburg. It is a struggle for territory, which has extended from the suburbs to the central parts of the big cities. The systemic crisis is not caused by people rooting for different football teams, but when fundamental moral beliefs are relativized to the point of meaninglessness, as when someone thinks that Christianity as well as Islamism is a threat to the social order, Christianity which, together with Jewish and Greek culture, is the foundation of European civilization. Perhaps it can be seen as another in a series of the Swedish school's capital failures in the transmission of knowledge and values. Inverted moral concepts. The crisis comes to the fore when moral concepts are inverted, as when a former national police chief turns his back on the victims of bestial crimes and instead tearfully laments the underprivileged social status of the poor, tormented and traumatized perpetrators, those who risked their lives to cross a peaceful Europe to reach the Nordic land of happiness. When, in the wake of the pedophile scandal, we learned that Annie Lööf was in a difficult situation and Fredrik Federley was in a bad way, the context became clear once again. In Sweden, it is not the victims who deserve support, but the perpetrators or those who turned a blind eye and allowed the evil deeds to take place. Now we read in Expressen about people who have been employed as supervisors of criminals, but who are themselves criminals. The newspaper reports on a case where a probation officer participated in or was present at the rape of a 16-year-old girl. A country in which this can happen lacks leadership and the morality that is a prerequisite for leadership. The systemic crisis is therefore also a moral crisis. The crisis is an effect of migration, but also of Swedish public opinion's response to it. Swedes tend to split into factions, and opinion fronts of a previously unknown kind are being established. Internal contradictions are hardening, as brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, relatives, colleagues and childhood friends no longer speak to each other but see each other as strangers, no longer as compatriots but as comrades in arms and enemies. How such a country can defend itself against an external enemy remains a mystery. The cheerful frankness at not so many years ago characterized the attitude to life, and the fearless approach to comrades not seen for a long time is gone. Nowadays, people are cautiously trying to find out about their attitude to migration policy before speaking their minds. In many places, such is the division that colonization has brought about among what used to be called the Swedish people, in their historic, and only, homeland. Add to this a cultural self-denial, a kind of intellectual and moral self-torture, which rejects everything Swedish and, for fear of being labeled racist, unabashedly celebrates everything foreign. All in all, the mental foundations have been laid for the perpetuation of the Swedish national identity and the common European cultural identity, the mental connections and structures that bind us most deeply together as a historical collective. The change has many faces. It can take the form of grotesque, moral meltdowns, such as when public opinion, instead of uniting in protest against Islamist terrorist acts or acts of violence committed by young men who have recently arrived, acts to curb the threat of Nazism or racism. Citizens of an older generation may be reminded of Viggo the Viking in Bengt Danielsson's six-part film The Year on the Island. Viggo is terrified when a fighter jet rushes by through the air, but is unable to take cover or escape, instead staying put, and starts preening his feathers. It is the same degree of rationality that the Swedish so-called cultural elite exhibits when the threat picture differs from that determined by its own standard prejudices. When a jihadist cuts the throat of a teacher in France, the ingrained reaction is an exhortation to fight against the alleged Islamophobia. And so, as SD approaches the center of power, DN's culture editor warns of the approaching cold. Why riots? By the way, why are there riots and vandalism of Swedish city centers and an African American is killed in the US, but not when Swedish teenagers are tortured by Arab youths in a Swedish cemetery? Or when 16-year-old Wilma Andersson in Uddevalla is decapitated by her Arab boyfriend? Or when Swedish girls are dragged into bushes and raped by men from Africa with knives to their throats? Or when a policeman is murdered in Biskopsgarden? Probably because the country is living in the midst of a collective moral infarction, where the concept of truth has been misappropriated by those who have long held the right to formulate problems and replaced by the relativizing value base, in which one of the constants is self-imposed victim culture and posing racialization. It is this intellectual starvation diet that has long been offered to the Swedish people and that has fed the dominant parts of public discourse. A few years ago, a Swedish scholar described the trivializing superficiality of the Swedish social climate as a triumph of emptiness. But underneath, the beams of reality are now cracking ever louder. Ahead of the 2022 elections and amid the current government crisis, the desperation of the Swedish government and its supporting parties shines through, fearing that their time is running out and that their busts will be exposed. The crisis translates into 1,001 rapes, murders, robberies and fires. It comes as the National Forensic Center is unable to keep its DNA bank in order and thousands of criminals therefore go free, and the innocent risk being tried as if they were guilty. And it shows up when insecurity permeates courtrooms, where disorderly conduct and aggressive behavior by detainees become increasingly common. It shows itself when relatives of police officers who testify are threatened with violence, or when the police authority and the chief of police in Gothenburg are personally subjected to bomb threats. In our country, ambulances and police cars are vandalized while on duty and ambulance staff can be attacked with corrosive acid. On November 29, shootings in the country in 2020 were reported to exceed the entire previous year, and on December 8, knife murders surpassed the number of deaths in shootings. In a country that has lost sight of its goals and the direction of travel has been blurred, police officers kneel before power-conscious mobs of violent vandals, and in the name of misunderstood free speech, a group of young immigrant women and their entourage are allowed to dance in front of the police and mockingly scream that they should fuck it up. How should the vandalism last year of downtown Gothenburg by foreign agitators and their Swedish collaborators in the AFA movement be interpreted, if not as a harbinger, an omen, or as part of a systemic crisis? The systemic crisis manifests itself when state authorities are infiltrated by clan-based or other criminal syndicates and Islamist organizations, when municipal officials in 20 municipalities must have security protection to and from their workplaces, when criminal gangs threaten elected representatives in order to influence the content of municipal council decisions, When social security systems are drained by people who, having secured permanent residence permits or citizenship, return to the countries from which they claim to have fled, shamelessly cashing out health insurance and pensions without having worked a day in Sweden, or when they set up bridgeheads in Sweden for the arrival of relatives of clan members, all in a kind of perpetual cycle of impoverishment. The collapse is well illustrated by the 45 IS-affiliated Swedes, who, while fighting in Syria, were sustained by Swedish contributions funded by your and my money. The Swedish government and civil service fund terrorism and provide financial support to people who want us dead. You and I pay, the Swedish political class and its embezzling politicians remain not guarding our borders. The systemic crisis is a result of not guarding our borders, and when Swedish authorities abroad previously advertised the social benefits that await those who come to Sweden, making our country a magnet for third world fortune seekers. The systemic crisis means that 57% of foreign murderers and 81% of rapists are not deported, that school staff are forced to carry alarms after violence and threats, that public libraries are closed because of the rampage of vandals and threats to staff and visitors, that the deployment of armed guards at hospital emergency admissions is being considered, that roadblocks are being set up by criminal gangs, that dockers and their families are threatened by drug smugglers so that they can ply their evil trade and vandalism unhindered, that newsrooms have been on the verge of shunning criticism of racism, rather than standing up for the integrity of the journalistic mission, that the justice system excuses criminals on the basis of their cultural or ethnic background through penalty discounts. The systemic crisis means a progressively more insecure physical existence for the country's inhabitants, of the kind witnessed in daily news reporting. The crisis manifests itself when Swedes no longer feel at home in their historic homeland and knowing Arabic but not Swedish is considered an advantage for employment in Malmö. A common language is what binds any society together and makes it possible to live a common history, and to tell it. Now the narrative is shifting, the story of Malmö tends to become a story of the new Nordic and Muslim Arabia. Nearly 900,000 people who are not registered in Sweden have been provided with documents that enable them to live and work here. Half of them have not proved their identity. So we do not know who is in the country, or what they are doing, or even where they are staying. At the same time, Swedish passports are in circulation in almost equal numbers. These are passports that the police suspect are used in connection with cross-border crime, such as trafficking, refugee smuggling, drug smuggling and arms smuggling. Social control has literally broken down. Do we know what we believe at all anymore when our unifying and identity-creating narratives are revised and retouched by self-proclaimed anti-racists or replaced by gender-certified morality cakes produced by activists masquerading as cultural workers or researchers, when in some cases universities change track from scientific truth-seeking to postmodern ideology factory? When our Swedish and European identity is suppressed so as not to offend non-European immigrants, when a cultural director of an evening newspaper stands on TV and defends a serious criminal rapper. The systemic crisis is an intellectual and moral infarction, which has set in when the world of ideas, the community of nations, and the community of values inherited over decades and perhaps centuries has been replaced by the newly constructed values, and everything that used to be so natural that it never needed to be mentioned is labeled as extreme nationalism. With the value base, the ruling class seeks to keep the people in check. It is the guiding manual of the corridor of opinion, and it is maintained by the politicos and journalists. But now the walls are cracking. Reality is a formidable enemy that all ideologues tend to underestimate. A reaction is coming. No attack. Nothing in this presentation legitimizes any attack on those whose origins differ from those of the shrinking majority population. There is much goodwill among brothers and sisters from foreign lands. May they be welcome. But integration into a functioning social community requires a degree of similarity and adaptation. The diversity template is a sham, a superficial deception. Segregation speaks its clear, unavoidable and depressing language. In Sotinas, where I live, things are still essentially calm, even if new cultural expressions have appeared. However, within a 4-mile radius are Lyskill, Uddevalla and Trollhättan, all with significant migration-related problems. In the neighboring municipality of Munkedal, gunshots were heard last winter. In Lyskill, riots have broken out and knifings have taken place in the open. There have been stabbings in Uddevalla. The disturbances in Trollhättan are nationally known. In Kungshamn earlier this year, an immigrant man was attacked by another from a neighboring municipality. So are background, ethnicity, culture and gender-relevant factors, or are the visible effects of migration paradoxically irrelevant to our perception of migration, as some columnists and columnists argue? Are the daily killings merely anecdotes in the discourse of the far right, or are they in fact part of a systemic reality? Will it be politically possible to solve Sweden's problems and a large proportion of the electorate continues to support the parties that provoked the crisis? The people decide what will happen to Sweden. Opinion polls show an anxious inertia in voter sentiment. In a culturally homogeneous country, this would be a reassuring assurance of stability and predictability. In the current situation in Sweden, instead, it portends deepening problems. Systemic collapse is still a long way off, but the systemic crisis has already begun. Anders Persson, Chairman of SD Sotinäs, member of the Education Committee and the Municipal Board. Former journalist at Göteborgs-Posten, Tidningarnas Telegrambyrå and Dagens Nyheter, head of press in the Army Staff, editor-in-chief of Armenet, head of press in the Armed Forces, analyst and editor in the Military Intelligence and Security Service MUST, press officer in Lebanon and Bosnia, head of analyst in Vesper Group.
Muista tilata Saunapatriotin kanava. Kiitos.